Welcome to lesson 3 of our 6 weeks journey coursing through Judaism's most important titles and the authors who inscribed them. Today, lesson 3, we are going to be focusing on the Talmud. So in your textbooks, we are on page 95. And we are going to be tackling, just like 2 weeks ago, we did Tanakh, and we defined what it is. We gave the history to it, and we explained where the books fall and who the authors are, etc. So similarly, we did the same thing last week for the Medrash. We described the genre, what the activity of studying Medrash, of attempting to understand things from the Torah using the methodology of Midrash is. We discussed the subcategories of halachic Midrashim, agadic Midrashim, etc. And today we will be attempting to do the same thing for Talmud. I would say that this is probably a very important lesson for many people, both because Talmud is so famous. In other words, if you've heard of any part of Jewish literature, you've often heard of the Talmud. The Torah, of course, and then the Talmud. And also because it probably occupies the most time. In other words, the most bandwidth in terms of Jews studying Torah is spent studying Talmud. So the question is what it is, and who composed it, and the historical background, etc. And then, of course, at the end, we will be doing a sample study of Talmud. As always, we will be tracking our progress on our timeline sheet. So you want to be on the colorful side, and you want to notate the orange bar, Talmud and commentaries. And that's where we are for today. As always, we will take a proper tour of the Talmud and all of its commentaries with a video presentation. We'll get to that soon. Okay, so let me begin by asking, what is the Talmud? You know, they tell the story about a man, non-Jewish man, comes to a rabbi and says, my Jewish friends are always bragging about their Yiddish cup. Raise my hand if you've heard of the term Yiddish cup. And Yiddish means a Jewish head. But in other words, it's like a certain way of thinking. And he says, my Jewish friends are always telling me that it comes from all their study of the Talmud and it sharpens their minds, etc. So I would love to have a sample study, study the Talmud with me. Explain to me what this type of study is all about. Non-Jew comes to the rabbi, he asks him, the rabbi's like, okay, sure, I'm happy to give you a sample. He says, would you like to actually study Talmud? He says, no. Explain to me how the logic works. He says, okay, I'll try. He says, let's say the 2 thieves climb down a chimney. Man is with him so far. Okay. When they come out, one of them has a dirty face, one of them has a clean face. Which one washes his face? Ron, which one washes his face?
Clean one.
The clean one. That's not what the fellow said. The fellow said the one with the dirty face. So the rabbi said, the one with the dirty face, how would he even know his face is dirty? He looks at his friend, he sees his friend's face is clean, he assumes his face is clean. Right? Therefore, he doesn't wash his face. The one with the clean face looks at the one with the dirty face, sees his face is dirty, assumes his face is dirty, so he goes to wash his face. All right, says the man. Okay, fine, good point. So the one with the clean one with the clean face washes his face. The rabbi looks at him. Are you kidding me? Hold on, sorry. He says, wrong. You're not thinking logically. He says, tell me, do you think it's possible that 2 people come down the same chimney and one of them comes down with a dirty face, and one of them comes down with a clean face? How's that possible? So the rabbi says, oh, the guy looks at the rabbi and says, oh, you're right. They must both wash their face. The rabbi looks at him and goes, oy veiz mir. He says, you still don't get it. Tell me 2 thieves climb down a chimney, right? And they're inside the house. They're worried about washing their faces. They're grabbing the jewels and they're running. This is a perfect example of the study of what is known as pilpul. Pilpul is a Hebrew word which comes from the Hebrew word pilpel, which means pepper, like black pepper, like pepper and spice kind of thing. And pilpul is when you dissect an issue to such a large degree that you've really covered it from every single angle. We don't often do this about problems in life. I think most of us are familiar with this, like at least people like myself, I guess, that have this kind of brain. We do this when we make big life decisions. Before you buy a house, what's the neighborhood like, and what's if this happens? What's if that happens? Let's do this, and let's cover my back this way, and cover my back this way. You make a big life decision, or you move to a city, or you take on a new job. If it's a big moment, so then often we examine it from 1.5 million different angles, but we don't usually do that just about a hypothetical instance. And this is the exercise known as, here, I'll bring it up here. This is the exercise that is known as pilpul. And a pilpul essentially doesn't leave any stone unturned. And the reason why Tanakh is so important is because this discussion we're going to have today about Talmud is so important is because after Tanakh, there really isn't another work that's as central to Judaism, that occupies as much bandwidth, as I mentioned earlier, meaning mental bandwidth of the collective Jewish people, than does the Talmud. Ron, we can see you, and we would love to see you because we know how.
Yeah, before I got on, I had to download a new version of Zoom, and I haven't had chance to configure it with the video.
No worries.
Okay.
So the question that we're left with is, what is the Talmud, right? That's the question we're really trying to answer today. So I have an easy answer. This is the Talmud. More precisely, if I were to pick this up and ask you what this is, and you were to answer me the Talmud, you would actually be wrong on 3 counts. In other words, you would be right, but wrong. This is the Talmud, but there's a few parts to this. First of all, this is only one volume of the Talmud, okay? And this, by the way, is a page of Talmud. Here, let me open it up here. This is a page of Talmud. You see one on the screen, and we're going to analyze it shortly. As you can see, we're gonna have a lot of fun with it. But the reason you'd be wrong in saying that is the Talmud is for 3 reasons. Number one is because this is only one volume of the Talmud. Okay, the Talmud consists of 63 what are called in Hebrew masechtot. Okay, so they actually have the same one in the picture as I do. That's the Oz V'Hadar edition. I don't know if you can see that. Compare mine to the image on the PowerPoint. Anyways, so the tractate that I'm holding in my hand here is tractate Shabbat. And basically it's one of 63 volumes, if you will. In English, they're usually called tractates because it's some sort of archaic translation of the word masechet. So that's number one. Number 2 is the Talmud is not really a book. In other words, for me to hold this up and say this is the Talmud is inaccurate because the Talmud is not really a book. The Talmud is more like a library of books in one place. In other words, when you open this up, as we'll do shortly, as you go through this page, this comes from one era of history. This comes from another era of history. This comes from way later. And we're talking about like 500, 1,000 years apart often. This is commentary from a different era. And some of these on the side here are only 100 or 200 years old. So when your class, there is no such thing as buying a Talmud that only has the Talmud itself in it. It's kind of an ongoing conversation. And every, couple generations when a new Talmud is printed, they might add another commentary to it. We could talk about that later, how they decide which commentary make it into the sidebars, etc. But it is important to understand that even beyond this conversation continues because there are many books that are not even included inside the volume of Talmud, but that are commentary on the Talmud, which are considered part of that exercise, part of that genre of the teachings of Talmud, which we're going to sample later today. And thirdly, so I guess that's point number 2 and point number 3 together. In other words, first of all, this is not a book. Right? A book, you usually think of an author or even a series of authors or even a panel that put it together. This is a summary put together by a few individuals of a conversation that went on over 500 years, so over 600 years. And secondly, then to that was added dozens of commentaries that explain and discuss it, which are not limited to this book, but go way beyond it. So these are the 3 reasons that just saying this is the Talmud is not really a full explanation. So let's start first by taking a tour of it with Rabbi Russell. We'll bring Rabbi Reuven Russell back, and please turn your attention to the video screens, and we will pick up where he leaves off.
This is the Talmud. 63 tractates, 523 chapters, 2 million words. After the Bible, the Talmud is the most important work of Jewish literature and has defined Jewish learning for centuries. From the outside, the Talmud looks like a book, albeit a rather formidable book, but from the inside, it looks more like this. Why is it so complicated? To decipher the Talmudic daf, or folio page, we first need to understand what the Talmud is, how it came to be created, and what a volume of Talmud contains. A volume of Talmud is not a book, it's a library of books. A typical volume of Talmud might include more than 100 works composed by hundreds of authors over a period of more than 1,800 years. Let's deconstruct the daf and then rebuild it layer by layer. The oldest part of the Talmud is the Mishnah, compiled by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi in the Holy Land more than 1,800 years ago. The Mishnah was the first officially transcribed record of Torah law, which up until that point had been handed down through the generations as an exclusively oral tradition. The Mishnah, however, is very concise, almost a shorthand. Over the next 300 years, many hundreds of Torah sages analyzed, discussed, and debated the teachings contained within the Mishnah, and these discussions became the Gemara, which together with the Mishnah constitute the Talmud. There are many pages of Gemara for each Mishnah, as these discussions often range far afield to include many additional teachings covering virtually every topic under the sun. The Gemara was completed in the beginning of the 6th century in Babylonia, written mostly in the Aramaic dialect that was the spoken language of the Jewish people at the time. Studying the Talmud is a challenging task. It requires knowledge of its often obscure terminology, being familiar with the many references to parallel Talmudic teachings, and an ability to follow the complex, multi-tiered arguments presented in its discussions. In fact, the Talmud presented on its own would be a closed book to all but the most advanced Talmud scholar. So over the centuries, hundreds of commentaries were written to decipher, explain, and discuss the Talmudic text. Some of these were published alongside the Talmud itself in recognition that they are indispensable to any attempt to properly understand the text. Rashi, the most basic and comprehensive of all Talmudic commentaries, was placed alongside the Talmudic text in some of the earliest manuscripts and published editions of the Talmud. But when one Talmud scholar writes a commentary, other scholars will offer alternative explanations or have additional questions and issues they feel the need to address. Flanking Rashi on the daf is Tosfot, which is actually an anthology of commentaries by dozens of sages, including a number of Rashi's disciples and descendants. The analytic and dialectic style of the Tosfot commentaries strongly influenced the manner in which Talmud has been studied over the centuries throughout Europe and beyond. Over the years, more elements were added to the daf to aid the student's navigation of the text. But there's a limit to how many commentaries a page can hold, even an oversized folio page of Talmud. So other major commentaries were added to the back pages of each tractate for ready reference, and many, many more. In addition, many more commentaries on the Talmud were published and continue to be published each year in separate volumes. Today, if you wish to research a complex issue, compare and contrast different opinions on a topic, trace back their sources, examine the issue's applications in multiple fields, you can open multiple windows on your screen and even hook up more screens to your computer. But centuries before Windows 1.0, centuries before electronic information technologies, Jews committed to exploring the multi-chambered laboratory of wisdom called the Talmud had already invented the original hypertext, the daf.
Hey, can I get a raise of hand if that was a little bit much? If that was a lot of information to process? Yes? How about this? Put your hands down. Raise your hand if you feel like you got that. Because I would love, what I'd like to do now is go through it again a little slower. I feel like he did a full overview. Let's do it a little slower. So let's go turn to page 96 in your books, 96, 97, where you have a layout of the daf. Okay, so if you didn't catch it at the beginning, daf, they usually translate daf as folio. Okay, so a folio means basically this, right? I hold up this book. This is a folio. It's a double-sided page. All right. In the Talmud, every page has side A and side B. That's where the pages are done. So, for example, I happen to have opened this up right now to Kuf Mem Bet Amud Bet, which means it would be folio 142, side B. So often when you will see references to the text, you will see side A and side B. Okay, now as we said, there are layers to the Talmudic page that are way beyond what your average book would contain. For starters, your average book is usually just a book. Even if it contains scholarly wisdom from many generations, that will be done by referencing them, by sourcing them, by quoting them. But it's one person's voice, or at least even when there's a few authors, they'll either reference when it's each author, but that's not what's done here. So let's go through this again. The yellow, okay, or A, yellow, gold, what color is that? Is the Mishnah. So the Mishnah, as we said, so in other words, we're starting with the center of the page. The center of the page has what we'll call the Talmud or the Talmudic text. The Talmud is often described as the Mishnah and the Gemara together is called the Talmud. The Mishnah was compiled in around the year 200 CE. You can see that on your timeline. If you're on the orange bar, it should be one of the first things, the Mishnah, right? You see that? Right around the year 200 CE. I think it's, the 180 something to CE. We'll probably have the year come up soon. So the Mishnah was the first time the oral Torah was compiled, and we're going to talk more about that momentarily. On the Mishnah came the commentary called the Gemara. These two together are called the Talmud. So in the center of the page, disregard the fact that on the one on the screen right now, which is also the one on your page, please disregard the fact that in the center there's a break. That just happens to be because this is the end of one chapter and the beginning of the next chapter, because every tractate is split into chapters, etc. So that's just what that is. Now, the reason they chose this page, though, despite the fact that it's not a classic page because it's where a chapter begins and ends, is because right when the chapter begins, it's always going to start with a Mishnah. Okay, a Mishnah is that oral Torah that was written down for the first time, which we're about to give the full historical context to, which was compiled in the year 180 something CE. After that, about 300 years later, close to the year 500 CE, the Talmud or the Gemara was compiled, and that's the rest of the center of the page, what on our image is labeled as B, okay, the Gemara. Now you're fast forwarding many generations, okay? Rashi lives in the year 1040 to 1105. He is the first commentary to be, first of all, it is important to understand that at that point, everything is handwritten. The first time that the Talmud, like the daf that we're familiar with now, the page that you're seeing in front of you now, is what we know as the Vilna Talmud. So it was printed in Vilna, I think in the 1700s, maybe even 1600s. So it's known as the Vilna Shas or the Vilna edition. There are other layouts to the Talmudic page. This is far and away the most popular and the most common and the one that you'll get in any store when you ask for a Talmud. Okay, so now we finished the center of the page. How did the people on the side come around? So the first one was Rashi. Rashi's on the outer, my apologies. Rashi is on the outer side of the page. Okay, so the reason that's a little confusing is because when you see this picture, you only see one side. Here in the Talmud, right? So you have two pages, obviously, right? When you open it up. Rashi is on this side and on this side, if that makes any sense. It's not really true, though. I'm not sure why they have Rashi. I'm getting a little confused here because Rashi is usually on the inner side. It's a little confusing because they're put here. This is the reason why I'm getting confused. Rashi is on the inner side. So on the left side or the right side of the text, whichever one is on the inside, that's Rashi. So for example, the page that we're looking at right here, Chaf Amud Bet, which is page 20b, would actually be a right-sided page. In other words, if you were looking at an open Talmud, it would be the right side of the page, not the left side, if that makes any sense, because Rashi is always on the inside. On the outside, right, in other words, the right and left on the outside of the pages is Tosafot. That's D. In the colors, it's orange. These colors are very similar. I don't know why they chose these very similar colors. And then as you get to the outer side, those are much more recent commentary, as you can see, from 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, etc. So those are commentary on the commentary. What he was saying about them arguing with each other and having conversations with each other, the point he was trying to make is that Judaism is a constant learning process. In other words, the Talmud represents the very experience of Jewish learning. Rashi comes and tries to explain to you the simple meaning of the text, right? For example, from Rashi's perspective, Rashi will rarely tell you, there's a conversation going on here. Rashi is going to explain it in its most simplistic manner. Rashi will almost never tell you, oh, but 3 tractates later, something contradicts it the way that I explained it. So therefore, maybe there's something else. No, that's not Rashi's agenda. That's Tosfot's agenda. What I love about Tosfot is that Tosfot, which by the way is a collection of people, which was compiled at one point, all of the Baalei Tosfot, there was many rabbis that were compiled into one commentary, edited into one commentary. kind of like if multiple authors write a book together and you have one editor, or like a magazine has one editor that oversees. So there are different authors, and he'll quote the different authors throughout, but he will there is one editor that put the whole thing together. So Tosafot, one of the things that I love about Tosafot is that they existed in a world that was pre-Control F. Does everybody know what Control F stands for?
Oh,
Control F is on a computer. If you have a massive document that's maybe, I don't know, gigabytes and gigabytes long, and you're looking for one word and you want to see how many times it appears in that document, you would use the shortcut Control F. It's like a finding feature for a document. Tosafot does that. He does that, though, on a much deeper level. It's a comprehensive, it's like an AI looking for it. Tosafot sees something going on in the Talmud. He says, let me see where else in the entire Talmud, which is why really it's a group of people that did this over generations, because this was a style of learning. That's the point. The Baalei Tosafot, what they do is they go through the entire Talmud and they say, where else is this topic discussed? And do these 2 points jive well, or is something being explained different in each area, and why? That's kind of their job. For yeshiva students today, Talmud is usually the greater part of their day. They spend studying Talmud. And I think this is why there's become so many layers and layers and layers of commentary on it. In one simple word, to reference what we spoke about in previous lessons, this is the oral Torah at work. This is the living organism at work. So of course it's not just going to be a book, it's going to be a conversation. It's going to be a way of thinking. It's going to be a culture. It's going to be, a way of relating to the world around us, which is through the Talmud. And that continues to cascade throughout the generations. Okay? Let's elaborate on that for a moment. The question we have on the table is, what is so unique about the Talmud? Why does the Talmud occupy the most time? Let's even just talk about time. If someone is going to study Torah, why is it that 9 times out of 10 it's Talmud, right? If they're not studying Torah itself, it's Talmud. Why is that? What is so unique about the Talmud? The answer lies in understanding what is unique about the oral Torah, because the Talmud is essentially the first time that the oral Torah gets transcribed, okay? So the short answer is that the Talmud is the most important and authoritative record of the oral Torah. So if somebody doesn't just want to study the Bible, the Torah, and its commentary, they're going to study the oral Torah and its commentary, which is the next level of it. By now, I think most of us here in this group are familiar with the differences between the written Torah and the oral Torah. We discussed it at length in the first 2 lessons of this course. We also discussed that the oral Torah is where the biggest partnership with God is found. That's where we bring our game to the table and we allow the Torah to enter our minds. And as a result, we often get things wrong, which is fine, but it's that struggle, it's not that struggle, it's that fusion of God's Torah in our minds. So if the Talmud is the first time that the oral Torah is written down, I think we can now begin to understand why it's so important. The next question I think that we need to address is, if this is the oral Torah, why is it written down? We are going to now move on to giving a proper history to the Mishnah and the Gemara. If you want to follow along with me on your timeline, right? So you're looking for the Talmudic era on the bottom. It's from about the year, let me see if I can get the exact year. Towards the end of the 2nd century. I think it's 180 something. I'm not sure where I have that number from. BCE this is. Anyways, so it records the Talmudic era technically goes from about 100 years BCE until about 500 CE. And I'll explain why it doesn't look that way on the bottom of your timeline. The reason for that is because the first book to enter the oral Torah, the first time the oral Torah is written down, is the Mishnah. But the Mishnah summarizes discussions from the previous 300 years, from roughly 100 BCE until about 200 CE. And then after that comes the Talmud, which again is not compiled until 500 CE, but summarizes conversations from roughly 200 CE to roughly 500 CE. So 300 years and 300 years. Over those 600 years, it's important to understand where we are historically. The Rambam, Maimonides, is going to give us a history as to why the Mishnah was compiled then. But before we do so, I want you to understand where the Jewish people are at the time, okay? Because before we say why a man by the name of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, known as Judah the Prince, if you will, or anytime someone is referred to as Rebbe, which just means teacher, not Rebbe, right? Rebbe is the Rebbe, you know him. But Rebbe is the name used for Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. They're talking about the author or the compiler of the Mishnah. Before we read Maimonides' description, which is going to be text 1, and it's really where we're going to start this whole thing. Before you read that, I want you to understand historically where the Jewish people are. Okay, so let's go back to our timeline. And you'll see that it starts the biblical era, right? So we all know that, right? So biblical era starts, we all know those stories. Moses, Jewish people, then the judges, right? So you're thinking Samuel the prophets, the judges, right? Samuel the prophet, King Saul, the first king of the Jewish people, then King David, right? I'm assuming everybody's familiar with some stories in this era. And then finally we get to a man named King Solomon, right? King Solomon is most notable for what? Anybody? You're all saying
The temple, building the temple.
Okay, Elise, thank you for being unmuted. Exactly. For building the first Beit HaMikdash, for building the first temple, right? What did the Jewish people have until then?
Shiloh in the wilderness.
Very good. Thank you. The tabernacle or the temporary dwelling place for Hashem, the temporary sanctuary, which traveled around with them first for 40 years in the wilderness, then settles in Shiloh for 300 something odd years, and then comes the first Beit HaMikdash. Okay, the first temple is built, and the first temple stands for how long? Anybody? 410 years. Then comes a 70-year break, right? The first exile, the Babylonian exile. Okay, beautiful. And then comes the second temple. The second temple stands for how long? Anybody? Also about 400 years. I think it's 420 years. The Talmudic era comes where? Take a look. Especially if you include when the conversation begins that the Mishnah is going to summarize. It comes during the Second Temple era. Okay? So 100 years BCE is right after. So 100 years BCE is when we're still in the First Temple era. The temple is destroyed right around 70 CE, and the first compilation, the first writing down of the oral Torah comes when? About 100 years after that, when they're in the middle of the Second Temple era. Why? This is a very important factor. These two things are influencing each other, okay? Because I'm going to go through that whole timeline that we just did now, starting from Moses and Joshua, etc. Let's do all that again, but let's try to figure out where the Jews are geographically, okay? So they're slaves in Egypt. They're taken out of Egypt. Every single Jew comes to Mount Sinai, they receive the Torah. Now they're wandering around the wilderness. They're all together in the wilderness, 40 years. They come to Israel. They conquer and settle the land of Israel over 14 years. Again, all together, they're all in the land of Israel. Now they live in the land of Israel. For how long, people? For how long? The entire time of the tabernacle, that's about 300 something odd years. The entire time of the First Temple era, that's also about 400 or 500 years, right? All together, you're looking at about a total of 1,000 years, or close to 1,000 years, 800 years, that the Jewish people are living in the land of Israel. The written Torah and oral Torah system works best if everybody is in one geographic location. Why? Because let's say somebody wakes up one morning and says, hey, I think tefillin are supposed to be pink, right? And he starts a movement called the pink tefillin movement. How quick does that pink tefillin movement get shot down? Very quickly. It doesn't take till they get to the next neighborhood to figure out, no, tefillin are not supposed to be pink. Let's not lose track of the tradition. Everybody here knows it's black, and you get a massive majority telling them tefillin are supposed to be black. They're not supposed to be pink, right? Let's say somebody says Shabbat is supposed to be on Tuesday. It doesn't disappear. The oral Torah is in such a small geographic location that everybody is constantly reaffirming it to everybody else. Does that make sense? It's a living organism, but it's a very well checked and balanced living organism. Now what happens? First exile, okay? What many of you may not know is that after the first exile. In other words, once the Jews went to Babylon, just because there was a second temple, and you would imagine, because this is the way we like to make patterns in our head, you're like, oh yeah, everybody probably came up to the second temple, and then Jews were back in Israel for another 400 years, so all was fine and dandy again. That's not true. There were many Jews that stayed in Babylon, and as you can imagine, because you already know what happened in the 2,000 years since, Jews started to trickle out of Babylon to other areas, right? So now they're in this area which was called Mesopotamia, and now it's called Iraq, Iran, etc., right? So the whole Middle East is now becoming swarmed with Jews that are all over the place, right? And remember, travel isn't as quick as it is today. So just because something happens in Israel, let's say a pink tefillin movement starts in Iraq somewhere, in Babylon somewhere, right? What is then known as Babylon. That doesn't get knocked down as quickly because maybe it spreads in the entire Iraq, the entire Babylon thinks tefillin are supposed to be pink, but in Israel they're saying, no, we know tefillin are supposed to be black, or vice versa. So it's a little harder to keep things in check, and this essentially becomes why Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, for the first time, writes down the oral Torah. Let's see this history in text 1. Phil, if you can, please unmute yourself. Text 1, the early history of the oral Torah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All the commandments that were given to Moses at Mount Sinai were given together with their explanation. The explanation is what we call the oral Torah. Moses transcribed the entire Torah by his hand before his passing, but he did not transcribe its explanations. Rather, he instructed them to the elders and to Joshua and to the rest of Israel. That is why it is called the oral Torah. From the days of Moses until Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, no one composed a text for the purpose of disseminating the oral Torah in public. Rather, in each generation, the head of the court or the prophet of that generation would write their own notes of the teachings they received from their teachers and teach them orally to the public. Similarly, each person would write down for themselves, according to their ability, the teachings they heard regarding the explanation of the Torah and its laws, as well as the new concepts that were deduced in each generation using one of the 13 rules of biblical exegesis, and accepted by the high court. So it is continued until the time of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi.
So he's giving you, thank you, Phil, a very brief overview of what happened, how oral history was, how the oral Torah was going throughout history, right? So take a look, zoom in on your maps to the area that's being highlighted on the screen in front of you. You'll notice that there's a 500-year gap from when the Tanakh is canonized by the men of the Great Assembly, which we spoke about 2 weeks ago, until the first oral Torah piece of work, which is 200 CE. There's a 500-year gap. Why is nothing of the oral Torah being written down? The answer is because the system is working. The oral tradition is working. Okay, let's talk about that pink tefillin movement for a moment. What would happen if somebody actually came up with a real issue, and it wasn't something like pink tefillin, which you can just look around at everybody else and see what color tefillin they're wearing? It's about something maybe that only happens once every 50 years, and nobody's memory is working properly, and they can't really remember it. How would they resolve such an issue? It turns out there was a system in place. Vicky, can you read text 2 for us, please?
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Okay.
Yeah.
At first, there were few disputes on matters of Torah law in Israel. Rather, a court of 71 magistrates sat in the chamber of chiseled stone in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. 2 additional courts of 23 magistrates sat at the entrance of the Temple Mount. And at the entrance of the Temple courtyard, an additional courts of 23 sat in all the cities of Israel. When a matter under dispute needed to be addressed, they would inquire of the court of their city. If the sages of the court had received a tradition regarding this matter, they told it to them. If not, they would go to a court in a nearby city. If they had received a tradition, they told them. If not, they went to a court at the entrance of the Temple Mount. If they had received a tradition, they told them. If not, they went to the court at the entrance of the temple courtyard and said, "So I expounded, and so have my colleagues expounded. So I learned, and so my colleagues learned." If they had received a tradition, they told them. If not, both went to the chamber of chiseled stone, where the court sat from the time of the daily morning offering to the time of the daily afternoon offering. On Shabbat and festival days, they sat in the hell.
Chel. The chel is a fenced-in area just outside the walls of the temple courtyard. Okay, that was just a technical point.
The question was presented to them. If they had not received a tradition, they told them. If not, they took a vote. If a majority said impure, they deemed it impure. If a majority said pure, they deemed it pure.
Okay, so there was this chain of command, if you will, which terminated at the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was this massive high court, right? This is very similar, by the way, to the justice system in the U.S., right, where you have the courts and the appellate system and then the Supreme Court, etc., right? We're basically, anytime if there was a dispute about what the tradition was, you took it to the rabbis in your town, right? Everybody's studying Torah. Everybody's trying to understand it properly. Everybody's trying to remember the traditions and the classes that they got. They're also going to classes by these rabbis. Beautiful. If a rabbi has a question, he goes to someone more senior than him. He ends up at the Bet Din. He ends up at the court of 3, then at the court of 7, then at the court of 23, then at the court of, eventually to the court of 71. The reason these are unequal numbers, of course, is that just in case they need a vote, they can vote and have a majority. And ultimately, that's what it ended up at. If it was such a huge issue that nobody throughout the whole system, nobody seemed to remember, right? And there was no consensus between the rabbis so then they would vote on it. Everybody has different ways that they remember it. This one remembers it as pure. This one remembers it as impure. So then the 71 rabbis, 71 judges, rabbis, etc., that were part of the Sanhedrin. Lot to talk about there, how you became a member of the Sanhedrin and what qualified you to become a member of the Sanhedrin. Lots to talk about there some other time. And then they would vote and they would go based on the majority. But a major change in the nature of the oral Torah comes about under the leadership of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who lived from 135 to 220 CE. By the way, he's a pretty significant fellow. So let me just give you a brief history. He's a descendant not only of King David, but also Hillel the Elder, two very, very prominent Jewish people in history. And he lived in the northern part of Israel, in a city called, primarily in Beit Sha'arim, and then later on in Siporis. We'll see these cities later on a map. That's going to become very significant. His teachers were also very significant. His father, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. And the Talmud says about him that from the days of Moshe Rabbeinu, there was no one who contributed as significantly to Torah study as did Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. He was also known as being what the Talmud calls Torah u'gedula b'makom echad, which means he was also significant in the secular world. Not just was he an amazing Torah scholar, but also he had tremendous wealth. He had a very, very friendly relationship with a Roman emperor whose name was Antoninus. Most people peg this is a name we get from the Talmud. So most people peg this as in the secular history as it's probably Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, who reigned from 161 to 180 CE. And it's because he perceived the danger that the oral Torah was in that he decided to do the big move that he did, which was text 3. Heidi, please. You got it.
Okay. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi collected all the teachings, all the laws, and all the explanations and commentaries that were handed down from Moses, and those that were taught by the courts in each generation concerning the entire Torah. From all of these, he composed the text of the Mishnah. He taught it publicly and revealed it to the Jewish people, who all wrote it down and disseminated it everywhere. Why did Rabbi Yehuda do this and not leave matters as they were? Because he saw that the students of Torah were becoming fewer. New troubles were constantly arising. The Roman Empire, which was suppressing the study and practice of Judaism, was spreading throughout the world and becoming more powerful, and the Jewish people were being dispersed to the far ends of the earth. He therefore composed a single text that would be available to everyone so that it could be learned quickly and would not be forgotten.
Thank you. And so we get the Mishnah. Okay, the Mishnah, again, not a book. The Mishnah is the beginning of what you'll know as the Talmud. And usually when people use the word Talmud very broadly, they're referring to the Mishnah and the Gemara, which are kind of the two parts of the Talmud together. But we're giving a proper history here, so we'll start with the Mishnah. The Mishnah is split into 6 orders, as they're called. The Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, the 6 orders of the Mishnah. Please hold. This is an urgent phone call. Sorry about that. So the 6 orders of the Mishnah are best described, I guess, in English as like 6 categories, if you will. And you can see them all on page, in figure 3.2. What page is that on? Anybody? You're all muted.
104.
Such good students. Everybody's muted. That's so beautiful. Page 104 in your book. So the 6 orders of the Mishnah are basically taking the entire Torah, any laws in the Torah, and it divides them into sections and into categories, if you will. Now, before we go through all 6 of them, I want you to understand that the Mishnah is made up in total, of course, of 63 tractates, as we said earlier, 523 chapters, same 523 chapters as the Talmud, and again, 4,184 Mishnahs. Okay, so Mishnahs are the subsections. It's like not a sometimes it's a paragraph, sometimes it's a half a page, but basically these are the Mishnahs that there are throughout. Now it covers virtually every area of Jewish life, and that's when they get divided into 6 categories: Zerayim, seeds, which will cover all agricultural laws and daily prayers; Moed, which means times, right? So Shabbat, holidays, those are all special times; Nashim, women, any laws that apply to the relationship between men and women, so marriage, divorce, and others besides. Nezikin is damages, right? That's where you get your torts, your civil and criminal law. Kodshim, which means like holy, sacrificial things. So any temple services, the kosher dietary laws, those are all like, sacramental concepts. And then of course, Taharot, purities, which are the laws of purity and impurity, the laws of ritual purity. On the right side, there's a column that I skipped, which shows the number of tractates in each section. And I would imagine that some of you at some point, and I would encourage you to, because to really supplement and properly go through this lesson, you would want to go to page 134 to 140 in your book. One of the additional features, and we always stress how in this course specifically, the additional features are very, very helpful, is it's a proper map of the entire Talmud. So each page, right? So for example, page 134, 135 is just Zrayim, just order number 1, the area called seeds. And then it'll go into each tractate and explain to you what it's all about, what the main topic is about, and then what else is discussed in it. They also have just some fun facts about it, like how many chapters, how many, you can see the icon keys on the bottom, how many Mishnahs there are, how many chapters there are. In the Babylonian Talmud, how many folios explain the Mishnah, or in the Jerusalem Talmud, how many folios explain it? And then on the bottom, they have just additional subjects that are covered off tangentially, as we'll see soon about how the style works. Now, what's not in the Mishnah, right? So you'll have noticed that this is a very legally focused text. The Mishnah, when Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi put it together, because let me explain something. If you're Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, you're engaged in something very pioneering, let's call it. You're the first one to do this. You want to be very careful about what you put in this, what you don't put in this, right? You don't want this at some point to be treated as the Tanakh, and then that just becomes, it's now 2 written laws. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi wasn't trying to get rid of the oral Torah. He was just trying to make the oral Torah sustainable. So what does he do? For starters, this book only contains the laws. Okay, so it's primarily halachic. I know we're going to talk much more about that next week. Legal, how you do and how you don't do things. There's not that much in terms of just Jewish wisdom. The notable exception to that is the one tractate of Avot, known as Ethics of Our Fathers, which does have a lot of wisdom and moral teachings in it. But for the most part, the Mishnah sticks away from that. It's what are you allowed to do on Shabbat? What are you not allowed to do? How exactly does a marriage work? What needs to be done by a marriage? What makes it? What invalidates a marriage? What's if they want to get divorced? How does that work? Is this thing pure, impure, kosher, not kosher? That's primarily what it's occupied with. So this was very crucial for Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi because he wants the main difference between the oral Torah and the written Torah wasn't so much whether it was written down or not. It was about the style of the way it is. The written Torah is about book learning. The oral Torah was always supposed to be about people learning, right? People being involved in the conversation. So he wanted to keep it that way. So one of the things that he did was he took the entire Mishnah and he wrote it down as briefly as possible. Okay? So what's not in the Mishnah? First of all, no moral teachings, for the most part, no moral teachings, no ethical teachings, no just wisdom, Jewish wisdom. It's for the most part just halachic rulings. And second of all, There's no, what else is not in the Mishnah? No lengthy, ongoing discussion about a detail. No, it's as clear cut as you can, and the rest of it will stay oral. The rest of the conversation around this will stay oral. And this was in order to preserve what we have called the living organism element of the oral Torah. Okay. What all of this means is that from Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi and on, from this compilation of the Mishnah, the core text of the oral Torah, in other words, all the conversations of the oral Torah revolve now around the Mishnah. It starts from the Mishnah and then it spreads forth. You can't really just read through the Mishnah and know the Mishnah by heart. It's much more about understanding the Mishnah and understanding all the conversations that there are around one particular Mishnah of the tractate. So this becomes, from then on, it serves as a starting point for any sort of discussion and exposition of the written Torah, which is essentially what oral Torah is. It all starts with the Mishnah. And that remains the case, by the way, till this very day. Even after the Talmud is completed some 300 years after the Mishnah, the Talmud is discussing the Mishnah, and the Talmud, in other words, the Mishnah and the Gemara together, is the starting point for any conversation about any topic on Judaism. So even though today, for example, next year we're going to talk about the fact that we have halacha today. Halacha is Jewish law, right? So we can open a book and see exactly what you're allowed to and what you're not allowed to do on Shabbos, even with details like, are you allowed to use a phone on Shabbos or not? Because there are books today that discuss that. But any book like that always starts its conversation in the Talmud and then works from there. So it starts with the Mishnah and Gemara and then moves on. So that is the Mishnah. What is the Gemara? That's where we're holding now. Any questions before we move on? Yes, Vicky.
How does that fast forward to today's challenges? You know, where we're creating DNA, we're creating like the halakha, kosher and dietary laws. We're creating new species, new ways of making things from DNA. I mean, how do you fast forward from ancient texts we could not have fully comprehended what's here today to where we are today?
That's an amazing question. The answer primarily is going to be in next week's lesson. Can you wait 1 week? I'll tell you why, because next week we're going to talk about halacha, which is Jewish law. And one of the things we're going to have to talk about is how you apply a law that applied in an era when they were traveling on donkeys. How do you apply that into an era when you're traveling in cars, right? And there is a process to that. And that's how halacha forms. That's how we come to laws. And there's a system more than a way that we apply it today, because we're going to need to apply it in 100 years from now to the next thing. You know, whether it's AI or robots or aliens or whatever it is, right? We're going to need to apply it to that. So there's a system more than there is, and then it continues to organically evolve over time as a continuation of the living organism. Yes, Phil.
Yeah, quickly, and maybe you discussed it, I missed, but can you explain the distinction between Babylonian Talmud and Jerusalem Talmud?
Oh, no, we haven't gotten to that at all yet. So far, all we've done is one simple thing. If you're not with me, let me recap. We are now at the year 180 something CE. Okay, the end of the 2nd century CE. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi has compiled the first book of oral Torah. It's a huge deal. He does it for very specific reasons. He dictates the reasons. Everybody knows the reasons, and that becomes the starting point for any conversation moving forward. The Gemara, which is what you're talking about, Phil, the Babylonian Talmud, Jerusalem Talmud, that's all the Gemara. That's the second half of the Talmud. Has not been invented yet. So far, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi has done this, and he thinks that's it. This is going to be enough. From now on, this will just be the core text for the oral Torah, and we will use this and move along. Okay? The next question is, what is the Gemara? And of course, we are going to talk, Phil, about the difference between the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. So the next question on the table is, what is the Gemara? The answer really is that after several generations after the compilation of the Mishnah, there again rose the need for an official authoritative record of the oral Torah. In other words, there were so many discussions about the Mishnah that 300 years later, they needed to do it again. So therefore, when we say Gemara, and right now, Phil, we're using the more general term, the Talmud, right? The Gemara. We're not getting into the Babylonian and Jerusalem yet, because they're both part of the Talmud. What is the Gemara? It is an updated record of the oral Torah. it doesn't depart from the Mishnah. It has the Mishnah included within it. And then it adds the Gemara, which is teachings and deliberations of the sages in Jerusalem and Babylonia in the 300 years following the Mishnah's compilation. So in other words, it's basically because the same thing happened again. Jews were spreading even further. Let's talk historically where we are, right? Look back at your map. By the time the Talmud is being compiled, 500 years after the Common Era or into the Common Era, here's really the big issue here. The Second Temple has been destroyed already about 100 years. So the Jews are now deep into exile and are now spreading all over the world. I mean, as big as the world was back then. So that's why the Talmud is required again. It's also required because there have been so many conversations since then that have taken different approaches to the Gemara. So therefore, they write it down. Now, to at least briefly answer Phil's question, I'd like you all to take a look at figure 3.3, which is on page 106 in your book, the making of the Talmud. Okay, so you'll notice that there are 3 markations on here. A is the city of Beit She'arim. Tziporis is also in that area, and those are the 2 cities that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is in when he compiles the Mishnah. Right? Things are much more Israel-centered then. And after Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud evolved simultaneously. But in other words, the difference between the Mishnah and the Gemara is a time difference. First the Mishnah, then the Gemara. The difference between the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud is a space difference. It's a geographical difference. They are evolving at the same time because there are 2 seats to Jewish learning, and they are in Babylonia and in Israel. In Babylon and in Israel. Now, Babylonia, by the way, as you'll see, has some very big centers of Jewish study. There was a city called Pumbedita, a city called Sura, a city called Narda, a city called Mechuzah, right? All these different cities, which are all very close to where Baghdad is today, all of these cities have huge yeshivas going on where they're discussing the Talmud. Later on, we'll talk about why the Babylonian Talmud became the more authoritative one. But before we do that, let's talk about what is happening in these yeshivas. Because the Mishnah already exists. So they're having an oral Torah conversation. They're having the living organism Torah conversation in a yeshiva, but it's all centered. It's all starting from the same point, which is the Mishnah. So what are they doing? The answer lies in figure 3.4. It is my favorite figure of this lesson and possibly of this course. And I'll tell you why. Any conversation. So we said the Gemara is attempting to explain the Mishnah, right? It's attempting to unpack the Mishnah and clarify a little bit, and that's where the arguments are breaking out. That's where the discussions are happening in what the Mishnah meant, what the scholars of 500 years ago meant when they said X, Y, and Z. So an unpacking of a Mishnah goes as follows, and that's why, by the way, they're in the same page, right? We said on the same page, you'll have the Mishnah on the top, and then for 3-4 pages, the Gemara will continue elaborating on that Mishnah. What are they doing in those 3-4 pages, or sometimes 20 pages? Where they're unpacking that Mishnah, how much can there be? There's 3-4 lines in the Mishnah, 8 lines in the Mishnah, 20 lines at max for the largest Mishnahs that exist. How much could you unpack from those few lines? Why does it sometimes go on for 20-30 pages on one Mishnah? The answer is because they're trying to unpack it in 3 directions. Okay? Take a look on page 107, figure 3.4. They are going forward, backward, and laterally. Okay, again, laterally, backward, and forward. We are going to go through them one at a time. Now, what I want to point out to you in figure 3.4 are the Hebrew words. This is what I want to start with, okay? The Hebrew words on the bottom of each little bullet point. Do you see that? So, for example, on the top left, it says, what is the source of this law? And then underneath it, there are the words mina, hani, mili in Hebrew. Or the next one, what is the basis and for reason that? So it says b'mai kamiflagi. All those little Hebrew words, okay, those are the words that if you were to hit Control F, in other words, put the entire Talmud into a computer program and search for those words, every one of those words, here's a guarantee for me right now, every one of those words appears at least 1,000 times in the Talmud. Because they're not really words as much as they are kind of your guideposts. any conversation is going to start with one of those words. In other words, there was a Mishnah. The Mishnah taught us a law, and now the Gemara will ask or begin a conversation on, will ask a question or begin a conversation on that Mishnah with one of these words. Do you see all these words? And that's also why, if there's any beginner's Talmud student, the first and most important thing they should be doing is collecting these words. It's what I did. I think I spoke about this last week. It's what I did with Talmudic students that I was learning Talmud with for the first time. I told them, you better have a little notebook handy. I want you to be writing these words down. You're going to write the literal translation of what these words mean, but you're also going to write down, whenever you see these words in the Talmud, here's what's about to happen. First of all, it's going to tell you if we're going forward, backward, or laterally. Second of all, it's going to tell you what is the exercise we're about to go through. Okay? So let's go through these three categories one at a time. If you're going laterally, essentially what you're doing is as follows. Laterally means you are going to analyze the Mishnah and compare it to parallel teachings. Okay? Now, this can happen in one of a few ways. All right? It can either be because you're introducing another Mishnah that you know about, and it's going to either explain or ask or contradict the current Mishnah. Remember, this Mishnah doesn't exist in a vacuum. This Mishnah is one law. For example, let's say it's a Mishnah that's teaching you a law about Shabbat. There might be a different Mishnah that's in the laws of kosher that happens to touch on a similar topic, and they seem to be contradicting each other. Or maybe the opposite. Maybe they can complement each other and explain each other. That's why you're going laterally, because you're comparing it to another Mishnah. All right? Another thing that happens laterally is that the language of the Mishnah is very concise. So let's just expand it. Right? Let's analyze the words, and from the exact choice of words in the Mishnah, we can learn something out of that. For example, the circumstances in the Mishnah might be very specific. Why would the Mishnah have chosen those circumstances? Let's try to extract something like this for parallel cases. If this is a little confusing, we're going to do samples of this soon. Don't worry. Okay? What about details? When the Mishnah gets detailed for no reason, tells you it's talking about a cow, when really it could have been talking about a sheep or a bull, right? Or it tells you it's talking about, I don't know, a person from this town, when it could have been talking about from any town. When the Mishnah gives you a random detail, it's not random. There's got to be something the Mishnah is trying to teach you. So again, you unpack that laterally. What's if the Mishnah tells us two laws, which I feel I could have inferred one from the other? Why would the Mishnah do that? Why would the Mishnah be so repetitive? Again, we're going to go laterally. We're going to try to figure it out. And then if there's more than one opinion in the Mishnah, which one should be followed? This is all lateral thinking. This is thinking about the Mishnah and extracting from it laterally to try and appreciate the parallels and the details of it, and all just with this Mishnah itself. Okay. Backward, we're not going to talk about that much today. Backward, we spoke a lot about last week. Backward is when you go, this is what the Mishnah says. Where does that come from in the Torah? Which verse are they getting that from? Where do they know that from? Or if there's an argument between two rabbis, why does this rabbi hold this way and that rabbi hold that way? They must be basing it on somewhere in the Torah that they felt a certain verse it implies this way or implies that way. So you're going backwards. You're trying to appreciate this Mishnah at its source in the Torah verses and in the Torah perspectives that are being embodied in this Mishnah. Forward means, okay, we have this Mishnah. Can I now make my own Mishnah based on this Mishnah? In other words, if the Mishnah tells me the law is such in case A, can I infer from that for case B, C, D, E? Or can I not? Or let's say there's an argument between two rabbis about a case, whatever case it is. Can I bring proof from that Mishnah that we just learned forward to back up one of these rabbis? That's another thing the Gemara will do. So again, we have laterally, sideways, analyzing the Mishnah and comparing it with parallel teachings. We have backward, tracing the sources and underlying principles of the Mishnah, going backwards to the Torah, and then forward, deriving additional cases and circumstances, which I guess is a little bit about what Vicky was talking about. Can I apply that to a cell phone? Can I apply that to DNA? Can I apply that to cars? To all the modern things that there are in today's day and age. But not all of the Gemara is just unpacking forward, backward, and laterally. Some of it is doing something else. What do I mean? A typical Gemara narrative, or what we'll call a sugya, includes a lot more than just the Mishnah. It'll extend to related and sub-related topics, going from what we always call meinyan le'inyan, from one topic, speaking of this, speaking of that, speaking of this, and then that's when the Gemara goes off topic. The most off topic the Gemara goes when the Gemara starts to talk about parables, history, philosophy, and advice for daily life. That's where the Gemara gets very, very fun, if you will. Okay. So that all of that is also included in the Talmud, and then eventually the Talmud gets back on track and says, "Okay, let's go back to the Mishnah. Did we finish discussing that Mishnah? We'll wrap it up, and now we move on to the next Mishnah." Again, just unpacking the Mishnahs that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi wrote. Now, before we keep going, so really the Mishnah and the Talmud are the same books, but the books of the Mishnah are much, much shorter because they only have the Mishnahs. For example, in the educational system in your average religious school, they start learning Mishnah at the age of, I don't know, let's say third grade, second grade. It's pretty simple stuff. Between second grade and fourth grade, they're starting to learn Mishnah. And in fifth grade, sixth grade, seventh grade, eighth grade, and on, that's when they start to introduce them to Talmud. Obviously, in fifth, sixth, and seventh grade, they're more teaching them how to learn Talmud. They're doing so by studying Talmud, but doing it very slowly and understanding rules, understanding sight words, understanding the style of the Talmud. And then by the time they get to eighth grade, ninth grade, and then throughout high school, what they're doing is they're studying Talmud on their own, amassing knowledge and becoming a part of this living organism. Everybody with me? Okay. Before we dive into the actual Talmud, the last thing we need to do is talk about the unique status of the Talmud. This is a very important point. I mentioned it last week, but here we're going to read it in the words of Maimonides himself. After the Talmud was compiled, the development and expansion of the oral Torah continued for the same reasons that it continued after the Mishnah was put into writing. But, so in other words, in the 1500 years since the Talmud was completed, there's been thousands of books on every area and subject of the oral Torah. But nevertheless, the Talmud is unique in that no subsequent Torah work carries the authority it does as a documentation of the oral Torah. In other words, it was kind of the end of an era. The Rambam is going to show this does it. It comes from a few reasons. First of all, nobody ever argues with the Talmud. Since the Talmud has been completed, nobody has ever argued with the Talmud. So in other words, I guess one way of looking at it is like this. For close to 1800 years after the revelation at Sinai, there was one central Torah authority, a supreme court, so to speak, right? The Sanhedrin, which we spoke about, that settled all issues of Torah law. The Sanhedrin was those 71 senior Torah scholars, which we spoke about. Okay, beautiful. During the Talmudic era, because of all the decrees against the practice of Judaism, eventually the Sanhedrin disbands. But the conversation still continues. The last consensus that we have had amongst the Jewish people has been the Talmud. The conversation continues. It gets written down as the Talmud, and then nobody argues with the Talmud. Everybody has been basing their conversations on the Talmud, and that's why the Talmud has that authority. Let's see this in text 4. Ron, if you can read it for us, please. Page 109.
In the years after the Beit Din, court of Torah law, headed by Rav Ashi, compiler of the Talmud, the dispersion of the people of Israel spread even farther. Conflicts abounded in the world. Travel became unsafe, and the study of Torah diminished. Jews no longer gathered in thousands and tens of thousands to study in their academies as before. Only the remnant few called by God would gather in each city and country to study the Torah and understand the works of the sages. As a result, the courts of Torah law that were established in each country after the Talmudic era did not have their decisions accepted by the entire Jewish people. These were only individual authorities for their country, as a great 70-membered court had been disbanded a number of years before the compilation of the Talmud. Therefore, we do not compel the people of one country to follow the customs followed in a different country, nor do we tell one Beit Din to enact the ordinances enacted by another Beit Din. By the same token, if one of the post-Talmudic sages taught that the meaning of a law is a certain way, and a latter Beit Din understands the meaning of this Talmudic law differently, we don't give precedence to the former or the latter, only to the one whose view is more supported by reasoning. All this applies to laws, edicts, ordinances, and customs that are innovated after the compilation of the Talmud. But as regards everything that is in the Babylonian Talmud, the whole of Israel is obligated to follow it, because all that is in the Talmud was accepted by the entire Jewish people. The sages who instituted these ordinances and customs and who deliberated their laws and taught these rulings constituted all or the majority of the sages of Israel who were the recipients of the tradition of the principles of the entire Torah, as was given over to each generation from the mouth of the previous generation up to our teacher Moses.
Thank you. In other words, the end of the Talmudic era was also the last time the whole of the Jewish people accepted the authority of the same central Torah leadership. Who can tell me about one major division that happens to the Jewish people after the Talmud? Anyone?
Judea and Sumer.
No. That's way before. You're talking about Yehuda and Binyamin. Yehuda and Yisrael, the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes. That's way before. Anybody else? It's one that still exists still today. Ashkenazim and Sephardim, anybody?
Oh.
Right? That's a division that happens after the Talmud, which is why till today you have Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardi Jews. The Talmud is accepted by every single Jew around the world as authoritative. And that's why virtually every book of Jewish learning today, everything, quotes the Talmud, whether it's Musar, Hakira, all the things we're going to talk about over the next 3 weeks, Halacha, Chasidus, all of these things, Kabbalah, they all quote the Talmud extensively because that is the last authoritative Jewish work of oral Torah. There is one more thing we need to talk about before we dive into the Talmud to actually do a sample Talmudic study, and that is the 2 Talmuds, as Phil mentioned earlier. As noted earlier, there were actually 2 versions of the Talmud happening at the same time in 2 different areas. In Israel, what's known as the Jerusalem Talmud, and in Babylon, known as the Babylonian Talmud. The Mishnah is identical in both Talmuds because they're both based on Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's Mishnah, and they're just expounding on it. They are different geographically, but they're also different in style, and that's because they're happening at 2 different geographic locations, which means there's also cultural influences of the local population, etc., that people think differently. Today, the Babylonian Talmud is considered the more definitive version. That's for one very simple reason. Well, I guess we could chalk it up to 2 reasons. Number one is because the Babylonian Talmud, I would say the main reason is chronologically. The Babylonian Talmud was completed 150 years after the Jerusalem Talmud. If you go back to your map on page 106, right, you'll see that there's a divide between the 2 areas, right? The boundary between the Roman and Parthian empires. And basically, the Jerusalem Talmud was written during the persecution of the Roman Empire, and this affected the process of recording the teachings. The Babylonian Talmud, however, was written under the Parthian Empire, where the Jews experienced a much higher degree of autonomy. They were much more, they had many more freedoms, which allowed for them, therefore, to make a much more comprehensive text. That doesn't affect the fact that there are also 2 different styles of the Talmud. So besides the fact that one of them is way later, they also have 2 different styles, and that might be another reason why the Babylonian Talmud today is considered more authoritative, or has the last word, if you will. The Jerusalem Talmud has a much more direct approach. There's very little deliberation. There's not, all the arguments that we're used to seeing. He says, and he says, and he says, and he says, right? But there is the Babylonian Talmud. And the Babylonian Talmud takes a much more winding approach at getting at the same point. It'll present a hypothesis and then have a process of finding the solutions, and that whole process will be delineated in the Talmud. Whereas the Jerusalem Talmud will just tell you, this is what they meant and this is why. Many have compared the difference to, just visually speaking, when you're looking for something in a dark room, right? So, Elise, can you read for us, please, text 5?
Okay. Here I go. The two Talmuds. As noted earlier, there are actually two versions of the Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud.
No,
In
where are
this-
you? Text 5. Right
Oh,
below
text.
the dark
Well, it's
room of the
Roman
question 5.
numeral 5 at the top, and then below it.
Yeah, you're right. It's section V also, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Sorry. Okay. He has set me in dark places, said Rabbi Yirmiyah. This is the learning of Babylonia.
In other words, one of the ways of understanding the difference between the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, in terms of style, at least, besides for the geography of it and the chronology of it, is that there are two different styles of learning. The Jerusalem Talmud is compared to looking in a room for something, right? You need to find something that's in a bright room. You're looking for your keys, let's say, right? And you look, you see them, you go, you get them. That's how you look for something in a bright room. In a dark room, however, when you're looking for something, there's a very different way of looking for it. The process is strenuous. What happens? You discover something, you pick something up, you look at it, you feel the shape, you feel the size, you feel how big it is, you smell it, and you're like, no, this is not what I'm looking for. Then you pick something else up, no, not what I'm looking for either. Let me go in this direction and that direction. And you're groping around in the dark until you finally find something. You're like, oh, these must be my keys. That's the style of the way the Babylon Talmud is going through. Now, this is not because they had a lesser power of deduction. Obviously, the people in the times, the rabbis, the sages in the times of the Jerusalem Talmud were doing that as well. The only thing is they didn't record all that in their Talmud. In the Babylonian Talmud, they recorded all of that because they felt that the process was just as important, if you will, as the discovery of the solution, or of the discovery of the new law. Text 6 is another beautiful way of putting it. Phil, you want to read for us, please? Page 112, text 6. Violent debate.
What is the meaning of the verse? I took for myself 2 staffs, the one I called Noam, pleasantness, and the other I called Shovlim, saboteurs. Noam are the sages of the land of Israel, who are gracious to each other in their deliberations of Torah law. Shovlim are Babylonian sages who assault each other in their deliberation of Torah law.
So one of them is much more violent than the other, not physically, right? But at least verbally. But yet, till today, the Babylonian approach is the one that generated more Talmudic Talmud. It's the one that, when we refer to the Talmud, when people refer to the style of the Talmud, go back to that joke at the beginning with the clean face and the dirty face, right? That's the Babylonian style of Talmudic thinking. And that became the hallmark of the Jewish wisdom and learning. And it's because there's something beautiful about really working your way through something as opposed to just being handed it on a silver platter. Even though he's calling that assaulting or violent, it's true, it is. It's a much harder process to go through. But when you go through it, you end up with a lot more wisdom. Vicky, we're just late on time, so I'll take this question after the class. Is that okay? Can you write it down?
It's like 1 second.
Okay, go ahead.
Do they really mean not assaulting, but more debating?
Yeah.
That's
But this is classic Talmud. The Talmud uses very strong language very often. Okay, what we are going to do for the next 15 minutes of the class is we're going to do an example of Talmudic study. Now, they gave us 2 examples here, actually. Okay, one of them begins on page 113, and the other one begins on page... hold on page 124. We are going to skip to the second example. Tonight, the way I'm going to do this, if anybody's interested, you're welcome to join. Tonight, the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to attempt to do number 1 in class, depending on time. I'll either do sample number 1 in class or sample number 2 in class, and then I'm going to invite everybody to stay after the class for 25 minutes, and then we'll do that in the library as an additional bonus, if you will, to the class. I'll invite people to stay, and they can do the second sample as well. For today, I'd like you all to turn to page 124, and we're going to really try and give a sample study of Talmud in order to appreciate how machlokas. In other words, the goal of this is to do a sample study, but also I want to teach you something. And one of the things that I want to teach you is why there's so much machlokas, why there's so much debate, right? We're going to go right off that last point we mentioned, which is that in the Babylonian Talmud, or in the Talmud in general, there's assaulting, there's violence, there's verbal violence, there's people really vehemently disagreeing with each other. Why is it so full of that? And isn't that an issue, right? So we'll start off with quoting Tevye. I don't know how many of you remember this scene from Fiddler on the Roof, but it's a distinctly Jewish moment. Tevye is schmoozing in the marketplace, and there's a group of other shtetl characters, and the conversation goes something like this. One shtetl character goes, "Why should I break my head about the outside world? Let the outside world break its own head." And Tevye goes, "He's right." Second man goes, "Nonsense. You can't close your eyes to what's happening in the outside world. You have to engage with the outside world." And Tevye goes, "He's right." So somebody else looks at Tevye and he goes, "He's right and he's right. They can't both be right." And what does Tevye respond? Anybody? Nobody remembers?
You're right.
You're also right.
You're right.
Why is this such a Jewish moment? It's such a Jewish moment because what's going on here is there's an argument between two people, and Tevye essentially, here obviously it's being done, very comically, but he's essentially valuing both sides of the argument. What do I mean by that? As we have seen, a major feature of the oral Torah is the variety, the diversity of opinion that there is inside the Talmud. And you would think that there's different ways of looking at this. One way of looking at this would be to say machlokas, or diversity of opinion, or varying opinions, is essentially it's a negative byproduct. It's a negative side effect of oral Torah. We already discussed why we like oral Torah, why we want oral Torah to exist. Oral Torah exists because that's the human element of it, right? That's the living organism part of it. And ideally, everybody would get along and everybody would understand it similarly, but we would be understanding it with our own brains, right? But actually, as we'll soon see, that's not the way Judaism looks at machloket. That's not the way Judaism looks at a disputation or at a disagreement between two sages. We look at them essentially like Tevye the milkman looks at those two people arguing in the town square. We look at them as both being correct. Let's read text 15, if you will. Heidi, if you can read it for us, please. We're on page 124, text 15 from the Talmud in Eruvin, the words of the living God. Don't forget to unmute yourself and go ahead.
For 3 years, the sages of the school of Shammai and the sages of the school of Hillel were disputing. These said, "The law is as we say," and these said, "The law is as we say." Then a heavenly voice issued forth and proclaimed, "These and these are both the words of the living God."
Thank you. This is a very interesting Tevye moment in the Talmud, right? But it's not about the shtetl, and it's not about the outside world. It's about God Himself, right? This is the Torah perspective. That when there's an argument between two sages in the Talmud, they're both right. How does that work? By the way, this is best described by looking at this volume. We don't have two volumes of this, one which records the opinions of Shammai and one or the sages of the house of Shammai, and one which records the sages of the house of Hillel. Why don't we? Why do we have one that includes both? Why are they both considered the words of the living God? That's a very interesting take on it, right? And the answer is that they can still both be right, even while saying opposite opinions. Let's try to understand this by using an example of a very famous machlokas, a very famous disagreement between Hillel and Shammai. Okay, so in Tractate Brachot, by the way, there are disagreements between Hillel and Shammai on every single field. Okay, and they argue when it comes to, for example, I'll give you some examples. Right, when it comes to the area of financial law, there's a discussion about guardians and how much responsibility the guardian has. If you give your item to someone else to hold on to for you, how much responsibility they have. Hillel and Shammai are there arguing, or the sages of the yeshiva of Shammai and Hillel are arguing with each other. When it comes to laws of reciting the Shema, whether you should be reciting it standing or lying down, discussion between Hillel and Shammai. When it comes to ritual purity, arguments between Hillel and Shammai. When it comes to cosmic mystical questions, right? Such as, for example, was the Torah created before? In other words, were the heavens created first and then the earth created, or was the earth created first and then the heavens created? Which is a whole, moral discussion about, like a philosophical discussion about our purpose here in this world, or what's the ultimate purpose of the creation of the world. They argue about that too. Whenever it comes to an argument between Hillel and Shammai, always their argument can be looked at just at face value. This one says like this and this one says like that. Or you can choose to look at the perspective that each of them is taking on this particular topic. Now, when it comes to the sages of the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, this is a great example because usually the perspective is the same. In other words, the perspective of Hillel and Shammai, they're usually disagreeing about the same perspective as they move forward. And you can apply that to almost every argument of theirs throughout the Talmud. So in Hebrew, this is called a lashitase, which means they have really essentially one theory, one way of looking at things, and that's why they disagree in each of these details. When it comes to the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel, the difference was whether you look at potential or whether you look at reality. Everything exists, an object, a person, or an event, on two levels. Potential, the potential that it possesses to be something, or the actual state of what it has become. And Hillel and Shammai, and subsequently their students, had two different ways of looking at the world. They argued, should we relate to the thing, or the person, or the event as it is in terms of its potential and what it could become, or should we look at it in terms of the actuality that you see here in front of you? Which one is more significant? That is essentially every single argument between Shammai and Hillel, or their subsequent yeshiva students throughout the Talmud. Let's see how this applies to one really random, so to speak, area of the Talmud. One really random argument that they have. Ron, if you can read it for us, please. It's text 16, page 125. It's a pretty famous one, by the way.
The sages of the school of Shammai say, on the first day of Hanukkah, one kindles eight lights, and on each subsequent day, one light less. The sages of the school of Hillel say, on the first day, one kindles one light, and on each subsequent day, one additional light. The reasoning of the school of Shammai is to represent the coming days. The reasoning of the school of Hillel is to represent the days that have passed.
So this is a very famous mitzvah. We're all familiar with it, right? And each of us lights the menorah, as we know, in today's day and age. We follow the opinion of the house of Hillel, which is we start with one light, then we move on to two lights, then to three lights. The house of Shammai, as it turns out, disagrees. They believe we should start with 8 and go down to 1. Why? Here's what happens. Following the miracle of Hanukkah, the sages established an 8-day holiday to commemorate the miracle of the oil. There are two different ways of looking at what we are commemorating and how we are commemorating. How is this miracle best depicted in 8 lights that you're going to light in a menorah, right? This is where the sages of Shammai and the sages of Hillel present their different perspectives. This is beautifully illustrated by a rabbi. His name is Rabbi Shlomo Yosef Zevin, lived in the 18th century, and he explains it as follows on page 126 in text 17. Phil, if you can read for us, please. The difference between potential versus actuality. Go ahead.
The theme of potential versus actuality runs as a thread through many of the disputations between the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel. The school of Shammai views things as they are in their potential state, whereas the school of Hillel views things as they are in actuality. In essence, on the very first night of the Hanukkah miracle, we already had 8 days worth of miraculous oil, as the potential of the oil had already been intensified 8-fold. On the next day, however, we only had miracle oil with the power to burn for 7 days, and so on with each successive night as the oil diminished. All this, however, is when we view the miracle in terms of how much potential there is, but when we view it in terms of actuality, the opposite is the case. On the first day, we only saw one night of the miracle. On the following day, we experienced 2 days of miraculous light, and so on, With each additional night, we experience more of the same miracle in actuality. This is the macholeket between the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel. The school of Shammai follows their approach of regarding things in terms of their potential, while the school of Hillel follows their approach of viewing things from the perspective of what has emerged into actuality.
Thank you. So imagine you're a Jew in the times of the Maccabees' time, witnessing the miracle of Hanukkah. On day number 1, you're only happy about one thing. You're happy with the menorah lit for one day. That's a wonderful miracle. That's how much you have in terms of actuality. Hillel says, therefore, we light one candle on that night. We're reenacting that moment as it played out in actuality. Shammai says, I don't understand. Why are you commemorating things that there are in the past? Commemorate all the potential that there is to be. The 2 miracles that happened already. But in this oil, you're holding in your hand miraculous oil that is going to burn for another 6 days, potential. So when you look at potential, you should really be lighting only 6. And the next night 5, and the next night 4, because the potential is becoming less and less. The fact that it already came out into actuality, that's beyond the point. This is the difference between looking at something in terms of potential or actuality. Now, why do I bring this argument? Because it's a classic version of an argument in the Talmud, which now that you understand the different perspectives, the way they're looking at it, it's very hard to say who is right, right? Imagine if you are an educator, parent, a teacher, someone in a position where you're meant to inspire someone who is young, right? You have a child who, or whatever, you have a student in front of you who has tremendous potential, right? You see it in them. They can ace every test. They can do everything in the world if they would only set their minds to it, right? But they're not studying anything. They're not doing anything useful with their talents, right? How do you regard this person? Do you say to yourself, and worse to them, who cares what your potential possesses? What matters is what you're actually doing, and you're doing nothing, so you are absolutely worthless. Does that sound like a good educator? Obviously not. If that's the approach you choose to take, you should not be around children or students or anyone like that. You should never tell anyone they're worthless, even if they are in actuality worthless, doing nothing. Why? Because you should focus on their potential. Okay, no problem. Let's go down the potential route, right? Fully. So you're going to look at them, you're going to say, don't worry about the fact that you're doing nothing. Your potential is amazing. Your potential is enormous. You could do whatever you set your mind to. So the fact that you're doing nothing, don't worry about that. You could continue to do nothing because your potential is fantastic. Does this sound like a good educator? No. Someone like that should also be kept far away from children. In other words, a true way to look at something is to appreciate the potential and to appreciate the actuality. You have to appreciate the fact that your potential is amazing, but you also have to learn to settle that into actuality, right? To anchor that into actuality, to bring that out with actual actions. If you're not, then it's not worthless because you have the potential, but you're not actually bringing that into actuality. So both of them are really true. Take a look, Heidi, if you can, please, at these 2 texts we have in front of us. Text 18 and text 19 are both from the Mishnah, both from Tractate Avot, which is the ethics of our fathers, where we said all of the moral and ethical and wisdom teachings are in the Talmud. And if you really pay attention to these 2 statements, you'll see that they're essentially contradicting each other. What is statement number 1, text 18?
Don't look at the container, but at what it contains.
Right? This guy looks like he's a low life and a no good nick and he's not doing anything. Don't look at that. Just look at him inside. Inside, he's a wonderful person. Judge the person on the inside. He has a wonderful soul and tremendous potential. That's what you should look at. But text 19 tells us the opposite. Reality check.
The main thing is not learning, but action.
It doesn't make a difference what a person knows inside. It's all about what they do. Can anybody say that any of these statements is 100% true or 100% not true? Of course they're both true. Tevye not sounding so stupid anymore, huh? Right? You're both right. In other words, the sages of Hillel and the sages of Shammai, when they're arguing about how to light the menorah, they are essentially both right. So now you say to yourself, hold on a second. So what should I do? Every night I should light 2 menorahs, right? That would be a very Jewish thing to do. Every night you light one of them, you light 8. Next one you light 1. The next night 6 and 7 and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As you move your way down. No. The answer is that when it comes to halacha, when it comes to practicality, we have to choose a law. We have to choose a legal way of what it is that we choose to make the actual way that we do something. And that's the subject of next week's lesson, which is all about halacha, right? But that doesn't take away from the fact that both of these statements are really true, beautiful Jewish statements. They're two ways of looking at Torah, which from a godly perspective are both true. Let's bring this home with text 20. Vicky, if you can, please. Page 129, text 20. All was received from a single pastor.
Torah scholars sit in numerous groups and study Torah. One group deems a thing impure and another deems it pure. One group forbids a deed and another permits it. One group disqualifies something and another renders it fit. Should a person then ask, how then might I study Torah? We are therefore taught, all of us receive from a single pastor. One God gave it, one provider, said it all from the mouth of the master of all works, as it is written, and God spoke all these words, Exodus 20.1. So make your ears as a hopper and acquire a perceptive heart to understand the words of those who deem impure and the words of those who deem pure, the words of those who forbid and the words of those who permit, the words of those who disqualify and the words of those who render fit.
Thank you, Vicky. And now we can begin to really appreciate how they are not just both are words of God, but how maybe the uniqueness of the Babylonian Talmud, which we looked at originally as like a necessary evil, right? That there are disagreements and there are not contradictions, but there are machlokas, there are disagreements within the Talmud where they're arguing with each other over tooth and nail. Maybe our limits are our strengths. Maybe through so much conversation, through so much analyzation in the Babylonian Talmud and in the Talmud as a whole, but specifically in the Babylonian Talmud, maybe what we're really getting is our subjectivity allows us to really see one perspective. And the other, of course, we should never limit ourselves to that perspective, but the other person's subjectivity allows them to see things from another perspective, and thereby we broaden our horizons by looking at different people's perspectives. So when you study Talmud, there's nothing wrong with siding with one opinion, saying, I really agree with this guy. But don't throw the other person's opinion out, just like the Talmud didn't. There isn't one Talmud for the house of Shammai and one Talmud for the house of Hillel. They're both extremely valuable because they provide different perspectives on the same thing. And I'll add one more point here. Next week, we're going to talk all about halacha. We're going to talk about how halacha came to be and how we decide whose opinion we follow, right? And that's how we decide what we do. That's the role of halacha. But I'll add one more fun little detail here. Do you know whose opinion we follow when it comes to the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel? For the most part, we follow the opinion of the house of Hillel. Do you know why? The Talmud tells us why. It says because whenever they would summarize their arguments, they would first summarize the other person's opinion and then they would say their own. In other words, whenever Beis Hillel would argue with Beis Shammai, what would they do? They would say, Beis Shammai, first let me make sure I understand your perspective. Because they weren't arguing with them in terms of saying, you're dumb, you're stupid, you have no idea what you're talking about, like many people argue today. They were arguing from a holy perspective. I see something from one reality perspective and you see something from another reality perspective. And so therefore, actually the biggest thing that I'm going to gain out of this conversation is your perspective. My perspective I know already. My perspective I know naturally. So they would start off by repeating the opinion of the other opinion, and only then would they move on to explaining what they meant to say to argue with them. Before they argued with them, they made sure they fully appreciated the perspective that was being presented by those that were opposing them. And it is for that reason that the Talmud says that's why we go most often, with certain exceptions, according to the opinion of Beis Hillel. Why? Because they appreciated that the diversity was not our biggest weakness, but actually our biggest strength. Next week, in lesson 4, we will talk all about halacha, Jewish law, and how that has evolved over time. Thank you all for joining us for lesson 3. See you all next week, either 1 p.m. online right here, or 7:30 p.m. in person for lesson 4. And we will talk about halacha.
Thanks, Rabbi.